Welcome everyone to the 15th, I think it's the 15th, annual Quentin Skinner lecture. In 2009, thanks to the generosity of Professor Skinner, who's here today, I'm pleased to see, the Faculty of History received funding from the International Bolzan Prize Foundation to establish an annual lecture in modern intellectual history since circa 1500. The principal task of the recipient of this award is to deliver a lecture on a relevant theme of their choosing, as well as to organise and participate in a related symposium. So accordingly, we'll begin today with a lecture on a major theme in 18th century political thought, before proceeding in the afternoon to two panel discussions involving expert scholars in the field. That's Gabby Malberg, Adela Halo, Tom Hopkins, and Greg Conti. Past occupants of the Skinner lectureship have included Avi Lifshitz, whom we just saw, Teresa Benjan, Karuna Mountainer, Tim Stanton, Joel Isaac, Hannah Dawson, Katrina Forrester, and William Salinger, and some others. This year's lecturer is Max Skjönsberg, currently Assistant Professor of Humanities in the Hamilton School of Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida, and appointed to Associate Professorship starting from August, so he's ascending. Prior to taking up his current position at Florida, Professor Skjönsberg was, and this is in reverse chronological order, a Legal Human Trust early career fellow at the University of Cambridge, and so known to us here, a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Liverpool, an associate lecturer in intellectual history at the University of St Andrews, and an associate lecturer in the history of political thought and political theory at the University of York. Before that, he took his PhD at the LSE and his BA and MA at the University of London. Professor Skjönsberg has a highly distinguished record of publication in 18th century political thought. Among his many achievements, he has edited the works of Catherine Macaulay, David Hume, and Adam Ferguson, and published some 14 articles in leading journals, along with roughly 9 chapters in collections covering such figures as Blackstone, Burke, Bolingbroke, Fielding, and Michael Oakeshott. He's also written on topics as diverse as ancient constitutionalism, enlightenment, representation, and, of course, party. The theme of party forms the subject of his first major monograph, The Persistence of Party, Ideas of Harmonious Discord in 18th Century Britain, which appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2021. I should say the book was shortlisted for the Constance Blackwell Prize and the Istvan Hunt Prize. The Persistence of Party addresses the role of party and its justification between Rapin de Torres and Edmund Burke, and includes, in addition, highly original treatments of Bolingbroke, John Brown, and again, David Hume. The book explores what Skjönsberg himself calls the paradox of party. While parties seemed to threaten a dissolution of government, they were also regarded as the source of vigour in modern politics. The book's theme is thus the constitutional role of organised conflict in the state. Constitutionalism is the subject of Professor Skjönsberg's second major project, entitled The Spirit of the British Constitution and the Birth of Parliamentary Reform, and this is scheduled to be published by Princeton University Press in 2026. The work will examine the shifting meanings of the English Constitution by focusing on the idea of its spirit. The concept of the spirit of the English Constitution can be traced to Montesquieu's guide to British public affairs, Henry St. John Viscount Bolingbroke. Well, this morning's lecture is based on the new book and explores the 18th century insight that there were principles that limited political power, even when exercised by Parliament. The book and the lecture seek to excavate ideas of restoration and reform articulated in the context of fears of corruption, and thereby illuminate a tradition of British political writers and reformers who wanted fundamental change, but without wishing for anything new. So, I invite Professor Skinner to address us this morning on the subject of the spirit of the Constitution. Thanks very much.
First of all, thank you, Richard, for that generous introduction. Richard, my former teacher, my mentor, and my long-standing and dear friend. Thanks, CRASSH, for organizing this event. Thanks to the history faculty at Cambridge for co-sponsoring it. And many thanks to all of you for coming. Many thanks to all my friends and esteemed colleagues in the audience, especially Robert and Jill Ingram, my colleagues in the Hamilton School at the University of Florida, who have traveled a long way to be here for this event. But my first and foremost thanks are due to Quentin Skinner. It is very hard to exaggerate how important he has been for the field to which most of us here are devoted, the field of the history of political thought and intellectual history. More than anyone else in the last 60 years, Professor Skinner has shaped this field through his writings on methodology, his research, and his leadership. It is a particular honor for me to hold a fellowship and deliver a lecture that bears his name, since I'm lucky enough to have been one of his students. I had the privilege to pay tribute to Quentin when he retired from teaching at Queen Mary University of London in 2023. Now I would like to tell an anecdote I left out of my speech on that occasion, because it would have been too self-centric for that event. A very brief anecdote. So it's from 2015, so exactly 10 years ago, at the dinner at the IHR, after the IHR Wednesday seminar in London. So just before this dinner, I had found out that I had my first article accepted for publication in the historical journal. I think I probably told Richard, perhaps Georgios Vargsakis, my former teacher, who is also here today, and then Richard and Georgios told Quentin. And Quentin told everyone at the dinner. And what I remember so clearly, but he may not, is how truly happy Quentin was to see a younger scholar and a former student having this achievement and having an article accepted in the historical journal. He seemed almost happier than I was. So we Swedes are not known for showing big emotions. But to see someone of Quentin's distinction and status being so genuinely happy about an achievement of a younger scholar was inspiring, to say the least. So thank you, Quentin, for all the inspiration. Okay, so now I'm turning to my lecture. Like Quentin Skinner, I am interested in the concept of liberty and freedom and its history. But unlike Quentin, I struggle to define what liberty is. I think many, perhaps even most of us, think that we know what freedom is by experiencing it and without being able to define it precisely. It's a bit like obscenity. We know what it is when we see it. Words are somehow not enough to capture it and define it. But that is, of course, theoretically very unsatisfactory. So in order to try and understand what freedom could mean, I take my cue from another historian of ideas with a background here at Cambridge, as well as my alma mater, the LSE, namely Michael Oakeshott. Oakeshott once argued that every society has its own manner of thinking about freedom and power, a manner which springs from its native experience. And Oakeshott was primarily interested in the freedom of the English freedom. And though I'm not English, I lived there for a very long time, became a British citizen, and I'm also very interested in the freedom of the English. I think for anyone who is interested in the concept of freedom, the attraction to the English tradition is simply irresistible. For Oakeshott, the history of English freedom, which was distinct from Roman libertas, French liberté, and German Freiheit, is not the history of an abstract idea, but the history of the establishment of procedures which enable men to enjoy their recognized rights, as well as the history of the transformation of the liberties of medieval society into the freedoms of modern England. According to Oakeshott, English freedom did not spring from any single principle, whether private property, parliamentary government, or even the rule of law, but rather what all the characteristics of English society seem to point to, namely the absence from our society of overwhelming concentration of power. According to this English way of thinking about freedom in politics, authority is diffused between past, present, and future, in a Burkean way, if you like, which is to say that it has a traditional component, but not one that dominates all political considerations. Power is further dispersed and shared among society's interests, as well as between the administration and the opposition in Parliament. In my work, I have been interested in trying to find out what this could mean in the period I work on, which is the 18th century. The English, or the British as they became, like to think of themselves as being blessed as a free people, living under a free constitution in the 18th century. The British constitution in the 18th century was often referred as one of limited government, but what made it limited? Was it limited because it had a strong popular element that gave the people an indirect say in politics by choosing their representatives? Was it limited because it was a mixed constitution in which all the country's interests had a share and could check and balance each other? Was it limited because the law applied to everyone, the governed and the governors alike? Was it limited because Parliament, rather than the monarch, was sovereign? Or was it limited because the people had rights, legal and natural, which a government could not violate? If one wanted to, one could make a case for all these ideas and suggestions in combination. Far from being stable, the meaning of the British Constitution in the 18th century was changing and contested. But one answer, I would argue, was especially important, was the idea that the British Constitution had a spirit. And this is why my lecture today is called The Spirit of the Constitution, and this is largely what I'm going to focus on. So what does this mean? So first of all, and this is probably extra helpful for those of you who are not working on the 18th century, spirit in this lecture does not refer to spirit in the religious or spiritual sense. So spirit here means something different. It means essence. So my question is, what was the essence of the Constitution? And more precisely, how could arguments for political and especially parliamentary reform be formulated based on the idea and the language of the Constitution as having an essence or a spirit? To put it very simply and shortly, I will be going into more detail. For reformers in the 18th century, political reform was acceptable when it conformed to the spirit of the Constitution, and in particular if it could revive the spirit of the Constitution, return to its first principles, if you like. In this way, British writers almost invariably distinguished reform from innovation, and this was true of Edmund Burke as well as Richard Price, as we can see on the slides. But where does the language of the spirit of the Constitution come from? So spirit was a key word in the 18th century. People were interested in the spirit of nations, which Professor Silvano Tomaselli here in Cambridge has written about. So we might think of Montesquieu, who wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, De l'Esprit des Lois, published in 1748. In this book, Montesquieu was showing that when we are studying legal systems, it is not sufficient to study their content, but we also have to study the laws sociologically. So we have to study the manners and the customs that have given rise to the laws and support the laws. But one of the points I would like to make is that when we are thinking about the British or the English Constitution as having a spirit, the key person we need to turn to is not Montesquieu, but a man called Henry St. John, first Viscount Bolingbroke. So as we have known since Richard Shackleton's path-breaking research, what Montesquieu wrote about the British Constitution and the spirit of the laws was largely taken from Bolingbroke, at least heavily inspired by Bolingbroke. So when Montesquieu, he spent time in England between 1729 and 1731. He met Bolingbroke and he studied his writings carefully. Bolingbroke is also the protagonist of Habermas's study on the public sphere, which might interest some of you. The spirit of the Constitution is a key phrase in all of Bolingbroke's main political works, and there were only a handful of references to this idea before him, so it's really his phrase and his argument. And as a footnote, Bolingbroke also invented, at least to my knowledge, the metaphor of the Tree of Liberty, which became very important later for American revolutionaries who studied Bolingbroke, then of course the French. And this was the same tree which Hegel may or may not have danced around in the 1790s. But did not Burke say, who now reads Bolingbroke, who ever read him through? Yes, he did, but he was wrong because almost everyone read Bolingbroke. I've already told you that Montesquieu read Bolingbroke, Burke himself read Bolingbroke, and others did too. John Adams claimed that he had read Bolingbroke's the 5 volumes of Bolingbroke's works all the way through 5 times, which is impressive. David Armitage, who is here, has written a very important article about the reception of Bolingbroke's Patriot King in the 18th century and beyond. In this lecture, looking beyond the Patriot King, Bolingbroke was seen as one of the constitutional authorities singled out here by the reformist Society for Constitutional Information at its inception in the spring of 1780. And in January 1783, the Society for Constitutional Information added Bolingbroke's dissertation on parties and his other political works to his publications. We also know that all decent subscription and circulating libraries in the English-speaking world held Bolingbroke's books. The one library I worked on, the Bristol Library Society, is no exception. Of course, just because the libraries held Bolingbroke's works, it doesn't mean that they were read, because not all books that were read, that were held by libraries were read. We know that from the borrowing records. But as far as we have borrowing records for the libraries, we can see that Bolingbroke was read. And we could go into a lot of details, but very briefly, this is the first 11 years of the Bristol Library Society. Of course, Hume is going to be on top, Hume's History of England. But Bolingbroke is up there as far as political works are concerned. Okay, so we see here 70 borrowings, and Burke further down for this is a pamphlet, of course, that was available in coffee houses, so it's not really comparing like for like, but just a couple of examples for illustration. And this library society only had about 150 members over this period of time. So rather impressive. We could look at other ones as well. back to the spirit of the Constitution. So Bolingbroke argued across his political writings that the British Constitution had a spirit that could be deduced from both its logic and its history. The spirit of the Constitution was that it was free, but what made it free? In short, it was seen as being free because government was based on the consent of the people, and this was ensured by the institution of Parliament. In practice, this meant that laws were constitutional if they had been enacted in the correct way by the people's representatives in Parliament. And these were old ideas with roots in Richard Hooker, if not John Fortescue in the 1400s. But on the basis of the spirit of the Constitution, it could also be argued that Parliament could act unconstitutionally if it passed laws that undermined its own fabric. And this was a move that was often made by Bolingbroke and others. So many, in fact, denied that Parliament was absolutely sovereign on this basis. It was sometimes, not always, but sometimes seen as being limited by the Constitution. And many would say that if there were no constitutional limitations on the legislature, the word constitution would simply have no meaning, some would claim. Okay. But in any case, Parliament was universally seen as very powerful, extremely powerful, and the immense power of Parliament meant that it was often said to be the institution that could undo England. To enable Parliament to be an instrument of freedom as opposed to political slavery, many Englishmen insisted that it had to be composed in the right way, elected in the right way, and free from corruption. And this is the point I'm going to come back to. Parliament is, of course, at the heart of many ideas about English exceptionalism. The English Parliament emerged, according to modern research, as one of several representative institutions in feudal Europe in the High Middle Ages. Scholars still debate the relevance of assemblies, such as the Assembly of the Witan, before the Norman conquest. But wherever we stand on that debate, what made England special was that Parliament grew in importance in the early modern period, whereas centralizing monarchs tended to dispense with their parliaments across Europe. This is, of course, what the Stuart kings tried but ultimately failed to do in the 17th century. So we all know that France did not hold an Estates General between 1614 and 1718. Denmark and Sweden became absolute estates in the second half of the 17th century, after having had powerful national assemblies before then. In Sweden's case, this was reversed for about 50 years in the 18th century. Some parliaments, as part of the general trend, however, some parliaments could become subordinated to another parliament. This is what happened with the Irish Parliament. Some were abolished, like the Scottish Parliament after the Acts of Union in 1707, but most often representative institutions were emasculated and fell into disuse. The French Huguenot historian Paul de Rapin wrote the following in 1717. The government of England is of a particular kind, and the only one of the sort in the world. 'Tis nevertheless the same that was formerly settled in all the kingdoms formed in Europe out of the Roman Empire. The difference that there now is between England and other nations in that respect proceeds from this. The English have preserved the form of their government ever since they have been fixed in Great Britain, whereas in other countries it has been by little and little totally lost or extremely changed. So, as you will all know, the English Parliament fought a civil war against its king in the 1640s and won. The monarchy was restored in 1660. The continuous tussle between king and parliament eventually led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89. And after the Glorious Revolution, we can say that Parliament in many ways comes out on top. The Bill of Rights proclaimed that Parliament had to meet frequently, which had not always been the case before. And Parliament, very importantly, also gained complete control over the public purse. And this led to annual sessions of Parliament in the wake of the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution is often seen as a landmark event in the development of modern representative democracy. But what is equally interesting for us, for the purpose of this lecture, is what happened after the Glorious Revolution. Political debate in 18th century Britain was to a large extent centered on how the mixed and balanced constitution was meant to work in practice after the Glorious Revolution, and how reality may or may not have departed from its ideal. And what you have is a complicated but unmistakable oligarchical drift, perhaps best exemplified by the passing of the Septennial Act in 1716, when Parliament prolonged itself and legislated for elections every 7 years instead of every 3 years. In the wake of the Septennial Act, and with allusions to the Roman state under Augustus, Bolingbroke influentially argued that the British Constitution may have kept its form, but was at risk of losing its spirit. This was a deeply influential argument. We see it repeated by a host of thinkers, in particular reformers in the second half of the 18th century, notably here on the slides, the patriot historian Catherine Macaulay, also reformers of different kinds in the early 19th century. Okay. So what were the problems identified by Bolingbroke? So there were several problems. A central one was about the frequency of elections. So 2 acts from the reign of Edward III in the 14th century had legislated for annual parliaments. These 2 acts had not really been followed, but they were often cited as precedent, and on this basis authorities from Sir Edward Coke in the 1620s argued that annual elections were part of the British Constitution. Another issue concerned the elections themselves. So between 1 and 5 and 1 and 6 adult males were eligible to vote in 18th century Britain. And because the electoral and representative system was so irregular, not everyone who owned property and paid direct taxes was enfranchised. So there were different kinds of constituencies. So first of all, you had the counties, which were relatively open and in which everyone who owned property worth more than 40 shilling in rent per year could vote. There were many different kinds of boroughs, some large and relatively democratic. So the largest one was Westminster with 12,000 voters, but also a large number of smaller ones, the so-called rotten boroughs, notoriously Old Sarum, which elected 2 members to Parliament by between 3 and 10 voters, despite no longer having any population in the 18th century. So many of the boroughs represented historic communities rather than current population. The more democratic and open boroughs were not always a good advertisement for a large franchise, since both rioting and bribery were rather rife. So rioting. In the larger boroughs, candidates were expected to treat voters and buy drinks for them. And this meant that open boroughs were very expensive to contest.
It's exams, just to be...
Okay. So just to give one example, Edmund Burke supporters spent £10,000 on having him elected for the open constituency of Bristol in 1774. £10,000 in 1774 is about £1.2 million in today's money, according to the Bank of England's inflation calculator. difficult to calculate, but roughly, that's roughly where we are. And today, to give a comparison, the spending limit for an individual candidate contesting a seat is about £20,000, I think. Another example, Earl Fitzwilliam spent £100,000 on having his son elected for Yorkshire in 1807. Yorkshire with 20,000 voters, the biggest county. And this is, according to the same calculation, £8 million in today's money. And I think the spending limit for a national party is something like £30 million for England and £30 million for the UK. So this is £8 million for one seat. So elections were very expensive. A further problem was corruption in Parliament itself, and one could go into a lot of detail, but effectively majorities were created in different ways in the 18th century. So first of all, you had political parties, the Whigs and the Tories. Party solidarity was significant for many, especially at the start of the century. It waxed and waned, and it became overall slightly weaker, at least by the middle of the century, as part of a rather complicated story, which I'm not telling today. But the governing party had to do other things to build a majority in Parliament. So the governing party, the Whigs, for much of the 18th century. So first of all, they spent money on elections, spent money on having the supporters elected. Second, they tried to convince independent backbenchers to vote for them, especially the more independent members of the counties, the country gentlemen. And third, they were also trying to buy votes in different ways in Parliament by using the crown to give jobs to MPs. So the House of Commons were full of members who worked for the government, just like today. Some of them had real jobs, but some of them had sinecures. But those who held positions under the crown were expected to vote with the king's government, and they were known as placemen. So the politics of opposition throughout the 18th century puts itself forward against this functioning, but admittedly rather corrupt system of government. And this meant that town and country were coming together on the basis of a program of reform, which is rather stable throughout the 18th century, as well as into the 19th century. And this is the Country Party platform, which had roots in the 17th century, but became really prominent in the Bolingbrokean opposition to Walpole. So the Country Party platform focuses on different ways, at least in the Bolingbrokean guise, the one I'm interested in, it focuses on different ways of bringing the constitution back to its first principles. And in this way, Bolingbroke drew and cited Machiavelli's discourses, and others did too. So the idea was that states and political systems decayed over time, and the way to renew them was to bring them back to their first principles. As far as I can tell, this is it might be the most common way Machiavelli was used in a positive way in the 18th century. So the traditional counter-party program, which brought together Tories and opposition Whigs, centered on more frequent elections, triennial if not annual, the expulsion of placemen from Parliament, and an end to bribery and corruption. It also attacked the financial revolution in the 1690s, importantly the national debt, high taxes, and relatedly the maintenance of the standing army in peacetime. And though there were some opposition Whigs in the first half of the 18th century, this was chiefly the platform of the Tory party from the time of the War of the Spanish Succession. And Bolingbroke and his friend Jonathan Swift were critical figures. Okay. And a lot of interesting reform ideas in the first half of the 18th century are coming out of the Tory party. So let me give one example. So Charles Grey was a Tory MP for his native Colchester in 5 parliaments, and he put forward a rather remarkable proposal for rationalising the borough franchise in 1751. So Grey was eager to strengthen the connection between landed property and political representation. Following Bolingbroke's Craftsman in 1734, Grey pointed out that Oliver Cromwell had realised this defect in the system of representation and put forward several patriot schemes before he became Lord Protector. And in power, Cromwell had indeed removed many of the small boroughs and added more counties and representation of the cities in the 1650s, all of which was reversed in 1660. But what on earth is a Tory doing praising Oliver Cromwell? So actually he was following in the footsteps of the Tory hero, the Earl of Clarendon, who had expressed his admiration for Cromwell's parliamentary reform in the history of the rebellion. And this is what Grey wrote, citing Clarendon. Lord Clarendon's candour induced him to say that this measure deserved the consideration of better times. Specifically, Grey proposed that every freeholder owning property worth at least 40 or 50 pounds, he couldn't quite make up his mind, should have the right to vote in every borough in the county in which he owned land. And the idea was that this would get rid of the worst rotten boroughs. Okay. Let's stay with the 18th century Tory tradition, but move on to a more familiar figure. So 18th century's country Toryism was also William Blackstone's ideological background. Blackstone absorbed and contributed to the Tory tradition that dominated the University of Oxford in the first half of the 18th century. As a long-standing fellow of All Souls, Bolingbroke was heavily involved in Tory politics, both in terms of university as well as Oxford as a whole. And one of his early publications, The Pantheon, a vision from 1747, was a defense of high Anglicanism, and it associated the Protestant dissenters with the good old cause, meaning Civil War republicanism. This mic is being a little bit strange. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Okay. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. It is, of course, as the author of the commentaries on the laws of England that Blackstone was primarily known in his lifetime, and his fame today rests entirely on this work. In the commentaries, Blackstone's explicit intention was to investigate the spirit of the Constitution. And, of course, as we know, in the commentaries, Blackstone made a famous case for parliamentary sovereignty. Yet, Bolingbroke's theory of sovereignty was not unitary or indivisible in the Bodinian or Hobbesian sense. For Blackstone, liberty was ensured by the independence of the courts, so the judiciary in that sense, the partial separation of the legislative and executive powers, and the equilibrium among the different branches of the legislature, the king, lords, and commons. Thanks to its mixed constitution, both the idea and practice of political liberty flourished in Britain, according to Blackstone. And what is more, the true excellence of the English constitution consisted in its system of mutual checks, which Bolingbroke described in a way very similar to Bolingbroke. He referred to Montesquieu, but the way he described it was a little bit more similar to Bolingbroke. Despite Blackstone's reputation for conservatism, reformers had high expectations on his work. Catherine Macaulay was very excited about what she heard about Blackstone's lectures at Oxford, and she paid tribute to them in her history, which we can see on the slides. And Blackstone had been lobbying MPs about parliamentary reform since the 1750s. And here's a letter to his close political friend, Sir Roger Newdigate, MP for Oxford University. In this letter, Blackstone is talking about the restoration of triennial parliaments and a bill against placement, among other things. So what happened in the commentaries? So in the commentaries, in a classic country Tory manner, Blackstone expressed concerns about the growth of crown patronage and what he perceived as the executive's influence over Parliament, as well as the expansion of the national debt and the maintenance of the standing army in peacetime, which of course he also refers to in this letter. And even though Blackstone himself represented a small borough in Parliament in the 1760s, he was critical of great men having a larger share in elections than is consistent with general liberty. Most significantly, he suggested that, and the quote is on the slides, if any alteration might be wished or suggested in the present frame of Parliament, it should be in favour of a more complete representation of the people. And he remarked that it was a misfortune that so many abandoned villages remained represented. So perhaps Jeremy Bentham was wide of the mark then when he derided Blackstone as everything as he should be Blackstone. Even of course he used Blackstone's words against him. So like Bolingbroke and other country Tories, Blackstone appealed to the ancient constitution as well. In 1759, he also published his own edition of Magna Carta. And in the commentaries he wrote, the second quotation on the slides, the liberties of Englishmen are not, as some arbitrary writers would represent them, mere infringements of the king's prerogative, extorted from our princes by taking advantage of their weakness, but a restoration of that ancient constitution of which our ancestors had been defrauded by the art and finesse of the Norman lawyers. For Blackstone, the constitution reached its theoretical perfection during the reign of Charles II, theoretical being a very important word. Identically to Bolingbroke, Blackstone argued that the Glorious Revolution, although the Glorious Revolution in appearance and nominally reduced the strength of the executive power, the Crown has gradually and imperceptibly gained almost as much in influence as it has lost apparently in prerogative. So the Crown has gained as much in influence since the Glorious Revolution, Blackstone argues. This meant, according to Blackstone, that though the revolution was agreeable to the spirit of the Constitution, it was not altogether so perfect as might have been wished. And such views will only surprise us if we forget that Blackstone's background was oppositional Toryism as opposed to pro-government Whiggism. In the late 1750s, and especially after George III's accession in 1760, when the Whig supremacy was broken, the Tory party and Toryism became less oppositional than it had been earlier in Hanoverian Britain. And this is amply illustrated by Blackstone's career as he became a government supporter. George III had one major objective when he ascended the throne in 1760, to break the Whig oligarchy's grip on power and abolish parties by welcoming the Tories back into the fold. In this sense, his formation was Bolingbrokean, and a document from his education from 1755 states clearly that George I had been captured by the Whigs and become their instrument for the good of their faction. So George III's accession meant that the Whigs lost their status as a natural party of government, whereas the Tories were welcome at court. This effectively meant that the Tories lost much of their cohesion and identity as an opposition party and basically disbanded in the 1760s. Whereas the Whig party identity, the Whig identity as a party became stronger in opposition. And this was particularly true of one Whig party connection, the one led by the Marquess of Rockingham, which was lucky enough to have the Irish man of letters Edmund Burke as its spokesman in Parliament. Burke's most noteworthy early pamphlet, The Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontent, published in 1770, was written in support of the Rockingham Whig party connection. The greatest part of the present discontent is made up of an analysis of what Burke perceived as the corrupt court system and an exposure of the so-called double cabinet, according to which government policy was made by the king in collusion with an informal group of advisors known as the king's friends, as opposed to the appointed ministers. That's a double cabinet. We know of Burke as a critic of Bolingbroke. I've already shown an example of that. One of his earliest publications was a satire of Bolingbroke's deistic philosophy. But Burke's key contention in the present discontent, the contention that the power of the crown was dead as prerogative but had been revived as influence, was drawing on the Bolingbrokean tradition, and the one that Blackstone was also drawing on. For Burke, as for Bolingbroke, it was key to distinguish the spirit from the form of the Constitution. If the spirit was violated, the outward form of the Constitution could remain intact, but yet be a dead letter. According to the literal Constitution, the literal reading of the Constitution, the king had the right to appoint his ministers. But, Burke pointed out, if the king appointed ministers without paying attention to parliamentary clout, the government would become divorced from the people. Ambitious men would seek court favour as a safe road to preferment and would not care to cultivate popularity and public confidence. Burke agreed with Bolingbroke in the country party tradition that the infrequency of elections since the Septennial Act in 1716 had contributed to turning the lower house into something resembling a standing Senate. This was not at all to Burke's liking. But Burke ultimately believed that the horrible disorders among the people attending frequent elections were too high a price to pay for shortening the duration of parliaments. But his more substantial objection was that more frequent parliaments, with their expenses, and I've given you some examples, would impoverish the aristocracy and the country gentlemen before they would drain the courts. And they would thus contribute to weakening Parliament in relation to the crown. So Burke's opposition to this form of parliamentary reform must be understood as part of his concern for Parliament as an effective check on the power of the executive and the power of the crown. Burke's most famous panacea was the politics of party and the return of power of the Rockingham Whigs. I've written about this before, so I'm not going to say more about that for now. I'm going to focus on his second, lesser-known solution from the thoughts of the cause of the present discontent. So Burke's second solution to the problem of the influence of the crown centered on what he called the interposition of the body of the people itself, by which he meant a more politically active citizenry and especially electorate. This might come as a surprise to some of us because we think of Burke as opposing constituency instructions. He's seen as the chief representative of the trustee theory of representation, according to which MPs should follow their own judgment. And this is true, but Burke never suggested that representatives should be inattentive to the concerns of their constituents. And in the present discontent, he laid out his vision for how the relationship between MPs and constituents could be strengthened by organizational means, He stressed the responsibility of voters to pay attention to the conduct of their MPs in Parliament, and to this end, they should arrange meetings and establish standards for judging more systematically upon their MPs' conduct. Quote on the slides. In order to do this properly, the public needed access to division lists to see how their MPs voted in Parliament. So in a word, Bolingbroke believed that the relationship between voters and representatives should be close, and that politics needed to be transparent for this to be possible. In the spirit, Burke also advanced the cause of administrative and financial reform in the late 1770s and early 1780s, which he regarded explicitly as a way of making the House of Commons more independent by controlling and reducing the Crown's budget. A very important part of the story. This is a time when the Whig Party embraces reform, once again embraces reform in the 18th century. And Burke also implemented a package of economical reform in 1782, which was one of the main reform achievements in the 18th century. What became known as economical reform united the Rockingham Whigs and the followers of the Earl of Chatham, William Pitt Elder and Shelburne in the Whig opposition. And this happened against the backdrop of the expensive and unsuccessful American War. In this context, and in opposition to the Stamp Act, the Earl of Chatham argued explicitly in Parliament that for law to count as law, it had to conform to the spirit of the Constitution. Burke did not go quite that far, but he did propose the spirit of the English Constitution as an alternative to the rigid theory of parliamentary sovereignty in his American speeches. And it was also against this backdrop that John Dunning introduced the landmark motion that the influence of the Crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished, which was narrowly carried in 1780. But the Whigs became split on the question of wider parliamentary reform, with Burke and his party friend the Duke of Richmond representing the two polar opposites, and the emerging leader Charles James Fox being sometimes in the middle, often moving between the two extremes. And this is a time when Chatham's son, William Pitt the Younger, picks up the mantle as the leading supporter of parliamentary reform in the House of Commons. And when the younger Pitt introduces his famous motions in favour of reform in the 1780s, he uses the Bolingbrokean language of the spirit of the Constitution, as well as the language of the influence of the Crown. So in 1783, he told the Chamber, the House of Commons, which according to the true spirit of the Constitution, should be the guardian of the people's freedom, the constitutional check and control over the executive power, would, through this influence, the influence of the Crown, degenerate into a mere engine of tyranny and oppression, to destroy the Constitution in effect, though it should, in its outward form, still remain. According to Pitt, this called for a bid to renew and invigorate the spirit of the Constitution. As Pitt told Parliament in unmistakable Bolingbrokean language, and in another speech he referred directly to the Patriot King. A few decades later, so moving forward, the Whigs, who, unlike Pitt, managed to carry out parliamentary reform in 1832, also used this language of the spirit of the Constitution, which never really went out of fashion in the period I'm looking at. The Whigs of 1832 Reform Act argued that the system of representation needed to be revamped for the Constitution to retain its spirit. And just to give a couple of very quick examples, Lord John Russell wrote in an essay on the history of the English Constitution that the abuses of our constitution are capable of amendments strictly conformable to its spirit. And when Russell, 10 years later, in March 1831, introduced the Reform Bill, he said that the purpose of the bill was to preserve the spirit of the Constitution. The more cerebral among the Whigs, notably T.B. Macaulay, combined this rhetoric with the insights of Scottish Enlightenment, historiography, and sociology. In short, they argued that the House of Commons had once adequately represented the people, but no longer did so because of economic changes and population shifts. In his speech, Macaulay said, "The ancient form of the representation remained, and precisely because the form remained, the spirit departed. Then came the pressure almost to bursting, this new wine in the old bottles, the new people under the old institutions." The language of the Spirit Constitution was used widely in the Reform debate and eventually worked. So when the first Reform Bill was passed by one vote only, 2/3 of the English county members voted in favour of it. Much had of course changed over this period I'm looking at, but I think that it's helpful to remind ourselves of Pocock's, one of Pocock's many helpful reminders, which is on the slides. So historians need to understand that the history of discourse is not a simple linear sequence in which new patterns overcome and replace the old, but a complex dialogue in which these patterns persist in transforming one another. And what I hope to have shown in this lecture, and which I show in much more detail in my forthcoming book, which Richard kindly mentioned, is that reform debates were a central feature of politics during Britain's old regime. And that criticism of the political system, based on the flexible yet essential language of the spirit of the Constitution, were integral to the political culture of the country. In a very influential study on English society, J.C.D. Clarke argued that the unreformed parliamentary system was not open to criticism in the light of its own principles. It could only be criticized effectively by the application to it of new principles, and these the Protestant dissenters supplied from theological roots. So for Clarke, the Protestant dissenters and their religious belief in natural rights, rather than the constitutional tradition, were the drivers behind political reform. But as I hope to have shown, it would be difficult to understand the 18th century Tory party's campaigns against the Septennial Act, Bolingbroke's Country Party, Blackstone's early reformism, Burke's economical reform, and the Younger Pitt's reform motions, as well as, of course, the Whigs of 1832, other than as part of the British constitutional tradition. In my next book, I also demonstrate that the Protestant dissenters also relied heavily on the counter-party tradition in several ways. And this was also true of the mainstream of the reform movement, even in the 1790s, which we sometimes misleadingly think that Thomas Paine transformed in Britain. To give one example, the Protestant dissenter, the Unitarian William Belsham, who was a member of the Constitutional Society, the Society for Constitutional Information, wrote in 1792, "In Paine's attack upon monarchy, there is certainly much virulence, and I think much weakness. It is truly to be regretted that a performance, referring to rights of man, in many respects so excellent, should be disgraced by such strange eccentricities." So to conclude, even if I have shown the persistence of the language of the spirit of the Constitution, in some ways this is a story about a road not taken. And I think that perhaps the later talks on the program today will illustrate this. I look forward to hearing them. But the oppositional and reformist discourse treated in my lecture reveals how arguments for change were formulated within a culture dominated by constitutional traditionalism. And this is not meant as an indictment. This discourse formed a cornerstone of the political culture of the 18th century Britain, to some extent the Anglophone world, and it was not only the method by which arguments for improvement could be formulated, but also the way that opposition to the government could be justified. The significance of this can hardly be overstated. Perhaps it could even be said that it was the fact that there always was a opposition, there was always a legal opposition to the government, in Parliament as well as often out of doors. Maybe it was this that ultimately made Britain a limited and free government in the 18th century, at least comparatively speaking. In this way, the shared idiom of constitutionalism allowed for the sustained development of legal and loyal opposition, so central to modern political freedom, as well as central for balance in the English constitution, in which the House of Commons became increasingly dominant. Opposition was acceptable when it could be justified in constitutional terms. And this was crucial at the time when the institutions of constitutional democracy were tested. Thank you.